Welcome to another episode of Bitcoin Magazine Live. And I have to say, today is quite possibly one of the craziest days to wake up to and start at a Bitcoin media company, to say the least. But I am your host, Q, coming to you once again from my mother's basement. And I am joined by none other than my co-host, P. How goes it, P?
Holy fucking shit. It goes crazily. As you said, this is a major news day for the Bitcoin industry. Excited to dive into it.
So let's just, explain what we have in store for you all today, because in addition to the craziest news quite possibly to break during this bear market, we also have an election day. And as we made mention to you guys earlier, this evening at 9 p.m. Eastern time, right back here on this channel, whether you're watching on YouTube, Rumble, or somewhere on social media, we will be back live with you, myself, P, and none other than Nolan Bowerly, to bring you live election coverage, again, 9 p.m. Eastern time. And of course, our guest today is going to be none other than Mathew Pines. We'll kick things off in news and notes in just a moment. But on the heels of yesterday's spaces with the Bitcoin Magazine Pro team, on the heels of Dylan LeClaire's, a 2-hour spaces that he hosted with the likes of Magoo and countless others who came in to discuss the ongoing debacles on FTX. We will also, in addition to bringing you Bitcoin Magazine Live, in addition to bringing you a live election special, we will be hopping on Bitcoin Magazine Twitter Spaces at 2:30 p.m. Eastern time. Dylan is going to be joining us. We're going to continue to recap what is going on there. I've talked a lot. We got a lot of talking to do. Let's dive into some Bitcoin Magazine news on today, Tuesday, November 8th. The biggest story in all of crypto land is none other than Binance. The number one largest crypto exchange in the marketplace has announced they are going to be acquiring the number 2 largest crypto exchange in FTX. I mean, we have been discussing FTT and the debacle going on there for the last 2 days in a row. The last 2 days we've been live. Starting on Friday, we discussed this. Let's rewind the tapes a little bit, though. The pandemonium really started with a fucking tweet. And let this be a cautionary tale to not troll the wrong person. SBF, all he said is he didn't know if CZ could show his face in DC. CZ took that personally, in the words of Michael Jordan, and let it be known. He let it rip. We discussed yesterday the unusual whales tweet, how CZ had confirmed that this was in fact Binance moving about 23 million FTT tokens into a wallet with an eye on liquidating. As this progressed, as we talked about it yesterday, you essentially saw members of Alameda, which is affiliated and tied back to FTX. That is a very important connection to have in the back of your mind. As CZ is announcing these moves all over Twitter yesterday, you have various members all the way up to the CEO of Alameda announcing and tweeting out saying, hey, whoa, CZ, we'll buy all of your FTT tokens at $22. Like OTC, like we don't need to mess with retail. Like let's do it this way. And CZ very kindly, very unkindly, however you want to say it, said, fuck right off, and went ahead and sold everything he had. Look, there's a very important distinction.
Well, no, it's a point. He basically said exactly that. They reached out and were like, well, buy it. And he said, with what?
Let's clarify. His action said that.
But what he actually said is almost as funny. He said, with what money?
So there's something really important, and I want to spend some time first on this sticking point. It's the $22 peg. When Alameda last night was trying to get in touch with CZ, offering to buy all of their FTT at $22 a share, some assumptions started to get thrown out. Shout out our boy Dylan LeClaire, who has been all over this. In fact, if you are not subscribed to Bitcoin Magazine Pro, let me tell you, those guys hit the head on the nail last night, submitting a report essentially detailing what they expected to happen. We're going to break down some of that report, because let it be known that these guys have a crystal ball somewhere, because much of what they said came to fruition. And here's where I want to really emphasize the $22 a share for, or price, whatever, that Alameda wants to be purchasing FTT from Binance. There's some speculation going on that this is most likely due to the fact that they have taken a leverage position against not only their own assets, but some potentially their own clients' assets, i.e., all of you retail holders who use FTX, they potentially, this is not yet confirmed, however, suspicions are brewing that this is the case, that they pegged all of these assets to a $22 per FTT token valuation. And if it ended up crashing below that, well, what happens when you peg something under leverage at a certain price and it goes below? Even P knows the answer to that question.
Go fuck yourself.
P, can you answer the question of what happens?
Yeah, you depeg and you get wrecked. You get margin called and everything bad, and all the bad shit happens.
Boom. And we were watching it in real time. Look, there's another really interesting thing that I thought is worth pointing out. Dylan explained it far more eloquently than I will in second, tertiary, fourth hand, if you will, try to explain it to you all. But I highly, highly recommend, again, if you are not following Dylan LeClaire, please go over to Twitter and follow Dylan LeClaire right now. He has been breaking this down in real time, and his analysis of it has been chef's kiss.
We actually included in the description to the videos, there's the link to Dylan's article breaking this all down, so you guys can check it out there.
Absolutely. Please do that. But something that he said last night that I want to present to the two of you, because this is where I think it could get really interesting. You're seeing some conversations all over Bitcoin Twitter calling for SBF to be arrested. Hey, his Ponzi is now becoming unraveled, like he was scamming and fraudulently claiming certain things to both investors as well as retailers. And then on top of that, to regulators. And here's where it gets interesting. Remember that connection I brought up between Alameda and FTX? There is a suspicion that the way Alameda was trading FTT in particular was using the order flow that they had access to from FTX to trade off of retail, no different than what we saw BitMEX get dinged for 4 or 5 years ago, which was very, very illegal to the point where their CEO is not allowed back in this country and BitMEX cannot operate in this country. This is absolutely bonkers. And the really important thing, we've been highlighting this too, SBF continues to make buddy with everyone in DC. He is becoming the regulator's favorite crypto boy, donating over $40 million to all the midterm campaigns.
He's buying politicians or attempting to.
100% he has been. And it's gotten to a point where I even think many of these politicians, those who've had the time to sit with SBF, those who maybe understand the broader crypto ecosystem a little bit better than some of their older, less technically savvy counterparts, they may even know how nefarious what SBF is doing. But hey, man, money talks and he cuts them a check. So they're not the one, he's not the one they're going to go after, at least for right now.
Yeah.
Go ahead, please.
I actually have a quick question. P, do you want to go or do you want me to go?
No, I was going to say, let's just, for everyone who's joined since then, what is the overall summary of what's happened? In let's say 5 sentences.
In 5 sentences, you saw Binance announce that they want to unwind their FTT holdings when they realized that FTT is overly levered by none other than FTX and Alameda themselves. As a result, you saw the price of FTT go below a $22 peg that Alameda had created under a suspicion many believe that they pegged and levered their positions at this $22 peg. As a result of this unwind, you now see FTX unable to have any liquidity to buy anything, any of those distressed assets that we love to talk about, how SBF would just go bargain shopping, buying whatever he wanted of these different distressed assets. Well, guess what? Looks like CZ learned his playbook because he essentially forced FTX's hand by selling this FTT, by cratering the price, by forcing them to get margin called. Now FTX is in a liquidity crunch. Well, what happens when you're in a liquidity crunch? You need to find someone to give you some money to get out of it. Otherwise, you got to declare bankruptcy. Well, it just so happens someone did. Just so happens, though, that the person who offered you liquidity is the same person that caused your liquidity crunch, i.e., the guy who forced your hand wants your whole fucking hand. CZ has then announced, as has SBF, that pending due diligence, Binance will be acquiring FTX.com.
Yeah. There you go. So the thing that's so crazy to me about this is the speed that it has happened over. This has been 48 to 72 hours that this entire thing has developed. And it's basically, as you said, it's like someone who wants to buy a property that you have, coming in, setting the house that's on it on fire, and then like announcing it and then buying the resulting flaming wreckage from that person. Chris, go ahead.
Yeah, I guess there's one thing I want to clarify as well. So also, since FTX knew that they held the majority position on FTT, their token, they also did not allow synthetic shorts or shorts on their platform for that token. But Binance, on top of having the FTT token that they wanted to sell, they opened up perpetual swaps, allowing people to short FTT on their platform, helping their case as they're dumping their bags. They could also short it and allow also retail people or investors in general to short it. So basically, like CZ is like, hey, we're going to be dumping a bunch of these tokens, and hey, do you want to short it and make a fuck ton of money while also hurting our enemies? You can do it here. So they get to make money on the shorts, on the trade. They also get to make money on dumping the tokens and shorting it themselves. So it's kind of like some people call shorting a bad practice or evil, but it's to prevent people that over-lever themselves and get themselves in bad position to basically wipe the bad liquidity or zombie companies out of the space. And that's kind of what we're seeing here.
I would actually clarify one other thing. I think shorting is much more important than that. It's basically a way for the market to signal or to discover the actual value of an asset. So people love to, when everything's crashed, they're like, shorting is bad, but it is a very important market function. And in fact, the ability to short the kind of shitty alternatives to Bitcoin that were rolled out during the block size wars was a major part of what allowed the block size wars to be won in what we would argue is the right way, which is small blocks. So
yeah.
You don't speak for me, P. Don't you dare ever try to speak for me again. But I want to America. I want to caveat something. You understand the block size wars, and as does Chris, far better than I do. So I won't get into the nuances of how shorting helped in that instance. However, I will challenge you and say shorting is a very dangerous practice that in turn, it validates the claim that the stock market in particular, which that's where shorting originates. Shorting is not like a new thing that crypto came up with. Like, no. This has long existed for over 100 years in the stock market. Jesse Livermore was a famous short trader, bear market trader. This validates the claim that these are just casinos. Because if you can play both sides of that trade, you are just gambling on, is it going up or down?
Well, yeah.
There is almost a degree of, what's the opposite of nuance? Like, what word would be the opposite of nuance? Because that is essentially what short trading to me is. You also have the risk reward ratio to me is fantastically crazy in that your upside, Chris and I talk about this a lot. If you buy something, just buy a whole long, your upside is uncapped. It can go to infinity. Theoretically, your downside is limited. When you short something, your upside is limited. It can only go down from where it's at to zero. That's how you make money on a short. But if it starts to rip on a short trade, your downside is literally infinity. So again, I say shorting, bless all of you who do it. Not my cup of tea. Validates, in my opinion, just the casinos that we all operate under.
Yeah. Q, I want to clarify one thing.
And also, one other point. The way this short trade has happened, in particular with FTT and FTX, is synonymous to the way a lot of shorts happened in the early 20s and 1910s, when short trading would bankrupt businesses and force them out of business because a bunch of high net worth individuals didn't like the way the CEO spurred them, or hey, they didn't like this product.
But that's just straight market manipulation, right? Like it goes.
Right. But the point I'm trying to make is the crypto markets as a whole are very synonymous to what the stock market was in the early 1910s and 1920s before regulators got overly involved in the space. And you are seeing certain things like, oh, SPF sent a tweet that CZ didn't like. Well, guess what? CZ now opened a short position against his fucking company.
No, it's worse than that. He gave everybody the ability to open shorts.
But that's the point I'm trying to make, is like, that is
it's a crazy thing. Yeah. I guess I'm just making the point that shorts are not a horrible thing in a
no, the point I'm trying to make is they are. They are actually, the way this was operated and done you are operating under the whim of what CZ wants. Whether
but we can separate shorts as a concept from what has happened here, which I agree is totally crazy and is basically, SBF was like, to CZ, and CZ was like, oh, you want to play? Let's fucking go. And then just ground him into paste and used these market dynamics in a way that, to your point, you saw a lot more of historically. But I still think that stuff happens. It's just a little bit less obvious. But, it's wild. The same thing happens with pump and dumps, right? Dylan also talked about the sort of flywheel in the crypto space, where basically you create a token, you then pump it, you then accept funding, you then use that funding to do more stuff. So it's this like crazy spinning wheel, and we're just seeing that being weaponized in to the downside.
Q, I had one quick question or one point to add. I know that you said that Alameda was buying basically the trading data or buying the retail information and trading. Okay.
No, they don't have to buy it. They're owned by FTX. They just have access to it.
So then why is that seen as a fraudulent practice? Because Robinhood does that all the time. And I know we bash on Robinhood.
So you're mixing two things up. Robinhood does not trade off of that information. What is happening, the suspicion is Alameda themselves is taking this information from FTX and trading it off of it. It's no different than, what was the company that Robinhood was selling the information to?
Melvin Capital.
Yes. So Alameda is operating as both Melvin Capital and Robinhood in this interaction. So that's why it's sort of like you just use all of your client information to.
So they're getting paid not just on the deal to order flow. They're getting paid on.
But they're not paying for deal to order flow.
On it. They're not selling that information. Yeah.
Yes, because they're one and the same.
Is that speculation or is that confirmed?
Yes, that's a little bit more speculative, but that is sort of the assumption being drawn based on the way certain actions are happening in the chart.
I think that's an important thing to distinguish as we're going through the story, because more and more information is going to come out.
No, absolutely. Look, there's a lot of the stuff that we talked about yesterday with Dylan was all speculation that came to fruition. So if anything, I'm not trying to throw Dylan under the bus. I'm just sharing a lot of the different speculation out there because there's some truth in some of it. Not all of it's going to come to fruition. It's just really fucking important. And I think I want to take it for a second. Let's go big picture for Bitcoin, and then let's go back to the debacle here. There are two main lessons I hope our audience listening, whether you're on the podcast, if you're listening on the podcast, please make sure to please make sure to subscribe and leave us a review on the podcast channel, YouTube and Rumble. Make sure you like and subscribe to the channel. Guys, the lesson here is the lesson we've been speaking about time and time again. If you play stupid games, if you play with the shitcoin casinos, just be prepared for something to happen. And B, get your fucking coins off of an exchange. Like, these are the two big takeaways and lessons you have to take away from this, even if you are not involved. Like, bless my soul, I've never even opened FTX. I don't have an account at FTX. Lord knows that I don't have FTT. Thank Jeebus, I don't. Thank Jeebus.
I want an update. Right now, I'm watching it crash. FTT is down 57% on the day alone.
So
holy shit. And it had already gone down.
It's below 10. It's at 9.
It's below 10.
$9.51. When we were going live, it was at $13, which is like 18 minutes ago, 20 minutes ago. It's down to $9.49 right now. It's crashing.
So important to note, because look, is Bitcoin in any way affiliate? Does the CEO of Bitcoin hold FTT? Is he going to have to liquidate? No, he doesn't. There doesn't exist. But just like in the stock market, where you see industries trade in sympathy. Oh, Facebook turned in this report based on ads. Guess what? Every single social media company is going to trade in sympathy with whatever happened to Facebook. Bitcoin right now is trading at just over $19,000. This morning, when we were in our 8 a.m. staff meeting, it was at $20,000 per Bitcoin, USD denominated. So the entire market is going to feel the effects of this, no different than what we saw earlier this year when 3AC, Celsius, all of these different sort of schemes blew up in our face. What was the contagion effect? We saw Bitcoin go from 30K down to 20, down to 28K, down to 20K. So we are potentially watching the next phase of contagion before our very eyes. I want to quickly pull up, I want to see what the public markets are doing, because this was actually something, okay. So this is something I wanted to discuss with you guys as well. P, you could probably go off camera because you hate when I bring up the public markets here, but it is important to know. We talked about this yesterday with Dr. Jeff, and he brought up something really important. while we talk a lot about the correlation between the NASDAQ index and Bitcoin, we've actually seen during this sideways movement a lot of days that have seen a down day in the indices in the public markets does not actually translate to a down day in Bitcoin. In turn, on up days in the market did not always translate to an up day on Bitcoin. We just openly discussed how Bitcoin has crashed down. I believe in the last 24 hours, it is now down 7% in total. Public markets right now not only
It's
are
down
up
10.2 in right now. Bitcoin is 18.5 right now.
Okay. So Bitcoin's at 18.5 right now?
Yes, it's 18.5
Okay.
right now.
Let's fucking go.
I need to buy some right now, real quick. Also, the point I'm trying to make, the point I am trying to get to while my two co-hosts continue to interrupt me is NASDAQ is up 1.5%, S&P is up 1.4%, Dow Jones is up 1.1%, and they are up on higher volume, which would suggest they are actually, we are watching this decoupling. It may not be a full decoupling, but the fact that the public markets are actually up on volume while the crypto markets are down, we are starting to see the beginnings of the decoupling in real time as well.
Wait, sorry. You said up on volume while the crypto markets are down. I am pretty positive the volume in the cryptocurrency space is also massively up. But I also don't think,
well, the reason I bring up just volume for equity markets is if this was sort of like, oh, we're up 1.5%, but volume is lower than yesterday, I wouldn't give this move any credence. And I would just be, oh, if anything, the trade that I was doing a lot this year.
Okay, got it.
The NASDAQ has been trailing. It's been trailing Bitcoin by anywhere from 1 to 5 days. And so if you actually saw lower volume on the NASDAQ, I would actually argue the correlation is going to be there and you're going to see the NASDAQ go down over the next week. But because there's higher volume, there's a case to be made that it's sort of holding where it's at. I just want to say, I told you, Pete,
I'm just like, trade.
Relax. Q is definitely a whale because he said he was buying, and now we're back up to like right under 19K. So he just bought like a crap ton.
Q, deliver us from evil. But wait. So I do want to iterate a couple things. Actually, Chris, I think I cut you off.
No, I'm just saying we were at 18.5 when I looked, and then I looked again. We're at 18.99.
We're at 18.7. I got 18.7 on stream.
Okay, wait. Enough price talk. Q, you made a great point that sometimes you do say things that are spot on, which is people need to take away from this. Get your fucking coins off the exchanges. Don't go freak out and lose access to your Bitcoin. Make sure you understand exactly what you're doing and you know how to take self-custody safely. But when a company like FTX starts to become insolvent, there is a risk that they are going to freeze customer assets in order to pay their debts. So they already, I think, instituted a delay on withdrawals. Do not get your shit stuck on that exchange. We saw this with Celsius. We may be seeing it with FTX. Get your shit off those exchanges. This goes for all exchanges, but especially these ones. And we don't know how this contagion may affect the rest of the players in the market. So learn how to do it safely. Take custody of your own Bitcoin. Not your keys, not your fucking coin.
Look at Mt. Gox. Now it's been what, 8 years, 9 years? Like this is history repeating itself, unfortunately.
Yeah, 100%.
I think it's also, one important caveat to all of this that both SBF and CZ in their announcements around Binance acquiring FTX.com, this is pending due diligence. There are some people calling on the potential that this deal falls through outright. My favorite take that I saw, this is just like, again, a speculative take, is what if CZ is literally doing this not to actually buy FTX, but just to like really show how insolvent FTX really is and how worthless they are.
I mean, there's going to be more twists and turns here, right? This is not over. So expect other crazy shit to happen.
Especially all the counterparties that are linked in with FTX as well. Like, them going down is not a good thing.
So I pulled up this comment from Barack. So FTX played with clients' money. This should be illegal. Like that is the $1 million question right here. A lot of people are essentially trying to uncover and figure out if, in fact, SBF levered client funds to create that $22 peg. He essentially created a Ponzi scheme as a result by doing this. He took money to then pay off other debtors, to then in turn say, oh, look at how profitable we are. In the same fucking cycle that Celsius was using. Oh, come here, buy FTT from us because like this is our token that we create. Cool. We buy, oh, the price is going up. Great. Yay. When in reality, the price is going up. Who are you buying those FTT tokens from? Well, you were probably buying it from Alameda. You were probably buying it from SBF himself. And in turn, as you sort of see it continue to go higher and higher, all of a sudden you get institutional investors excited. Oh, you're donating money to all these different regulators, so they're going to be kept happy and kept at bay in case something happens. You are going to see in real time someone who is viewed as a hero in this space vilified very quickly. I brought this up how my girlfriend, she sent me a random TikTok that she stumbled across of like, oh, like, have you interviewed this guy? You should maybe have him on your show. And it was like this, it was a TikTok interview of SBF, but it was like all his philanthropic efforts and all the like good, nice, great things he does for the world, how he promised to donate all of his wealth to charity when he dies, all this fucking bullshit. When in reality, all he does is operate the second largest crypto casino in the world that, mind you, we haven't even brought this point up. They had plans, and we discussed this when the news broke, when FTX was applying to become a fully accredited stock exchange as well as a crypto exchange. So they had eyes on being a full-blown casino. Obviously, those plans are probably going to be halted in the intermediate term.
Anything's possible.
I just want to know, P, what did you say to CZ to piss him off? And do we need to be worried right now?
No, I didn't say anything, man. I just sort of, implied that maybe he should consider absolutely destroying Sam Bankman-Fried, and he took it and ran with it. But I can't be held accountable for what he did.
And I guess the broader question to the two of you, but I'll let Chris answer this first, is there not a little bit of like a chef's kiss to the fact that the playbook that CZ has used on FTX in this iteration to essentially buy FTX has in turn been the same playbook that Sam Bankman-Fried and FTX have used to acquire countless other companies, especially during this bear market cycle? Is there?
Oh, yeah. No, it's like literally the same thing. It's like a bigger fish eats a smaller fish, but now the big fish is getting eaten by a gigantic shark. So that's the way that I equate it, at least.
Yeah, it is. I definitely feel like this is you made your bed, now you got to fucking sleep in it. It's like the two astronauts, the one's like, wait, it was a scam all along. And then the guy behind him is like, always has been. That's exactly what's going on here. So yes, the Schadenfreude is.
It's just like, karma will always come back. Like, I hope this is a lesson. This is the third lesson. So the first two lessons are stop shitcoining, just hold Bitcoin. If you do not leave it on these exchanges for risk of if they become insolvent or whatever they do on top of your Bitcoin holdings, get it off of an exchange and put it in your own self-storage. And karma's a bitch. Don't be an asshole to people and other businesses because it will come to rue one day, my friends. P, do you have any final thoughts on this FTX Binance stuff? This is going to continue to be a developing story. We will continue to report on it. And a reminder, in about 1 hour, we are going to hop on over to Twitter Spaces with none other than Dylan LeClaire. We now have word that none other than Pete Rizzo as well will be joining us. So
and Dr. Jeff Ross.
And Dr. Oh man, like you're not just hang out with us all day, guys. Don't do anything. I want to end on a little
quit your job, listen to us 24/7, 365. Let's fucking go.
So I want to end on a little bit of a lighter note because, today is Tuesday, November 8th. It is also election day here in the United States of America. Vote, don't vote, do whatever you see is fit. I will say this for myself, given how much content we're going to bring you guys, does not look like I'm going to have time to physically go in, but Chris may have a story to share about his voting experience, if we will end on that before going to a commercial break.
Yeah, guys. So very important to get out and vote. And what I mean by that is buying Bitcoin and taking it in self-custody. But if you want to do the more traditional one, if you're in the US and going out and voting at a voting booth, which I also recommend, I did. There was a bunch of blanks on there, like, fill in the blanks. I put Q on a bunch of them. So, Q is going to be the Board of Education, chairs 2, 3, 4. He's also going to be the Soil and Water Conservation Chairman of the board. That would be really funny. I think, Q, you do a great job. So get out there, vote. I was debating putting Satoshi Nakamoto as well, but, I just put Q on there. The reason
this message was approved by Q for write-in candidacy all over the United States of America.
There was
Guys,
actually
what the
two
fuck,
spots
man?
for the board. I didn't put P, and P. I just couldn't lose both my hosts at the same time.
Oh,
And
nice
I just
recovery.
know that Q
Nice
is
save. Nice save. It was
just.
close. It's close. You almost lost your job.
P,
But
just note these are for educational positions, and Chris intends to one day have children in these neighborhoods, so he did not want you to impact his child's education one day.
oh, that's
Let it
fair.
be
I would have
known.
showed up. I would have showed up with a tattoo gun and been like, "Let's fucking go, Bitcoin on your forehead, 5-year-olds," and then it would have been bad news bears.
On that note, I want to remind everyone that tickets for Bitcoin 2023 are available. We are going back to Miami May 18th through the 20th. Ticket prices are going up this Friday. Use promo code BMLive to get 10% off. And I'm going to sneakily tell you this before the company gets really mad at me. If you go and buy with Bitcoin, you will get a discount. But I played with the system a little bit. And on top of the discount you'll get from Bitcoin, if you use the promo code BMLive, you can get an additional 10% off of the Bitcoin discount. If you don't like spending your Bitcoin, just go buy some Bitcoin immediately and go drop it on these tickets. We want to see you in Miami. Come hang out with us May 18th through the 20th. And of course, the promo code BMLive works for everything in the Bitcoin Magazine store, including the latest edition of the print magazine, the Orange Party Edition, which should be arriving this week for those who are already subscribed. Guys, let's cut to a commercial break, and we are going to be joined by none other than Mathew Pines. Thank you very much for sticking through those commercial breaks, and I am excited to introduce our guest for today, friend of the show. He is a managing consultant for Krebs Stamos and a national security fellow at the Bitcoin Policy Institute. Most famously, however, he is best known for being one of the only two people on Twitter that P actually has push notifications for. Welcome back to the show, Matt Pines.
How's it going, guys?
It's a day, man. It's a day. How are you doing? How's the news treated you today?
It's going good. Been busy. It's been in meetings most of the morning, so not sure if there's anything I've been missing. Maybe fill me in. Just another day in crypto land.
Yeah, no, you haven't.
Just another day in a bear market.
Yeah,
That's right.
I was gonna send the feds out to grab Daquan from the live stream he's on.
Yeah.
Well, let's start there, because I caught this news while we were on the commercial break, but right now there's a live stream going on a different channel. I don't want our viewers to go there, but Daquan is live right now, and I'm just wondering how, why, like, is he just like, I don't know anymore, man. Like they've got to just be the greatest trolls out there, the way they behave. Between SBF, CZ, Daquan, Mashinsky, they are just trolls, right?
I mean, these people aren't exactly the best risk managers, so it doesn't surprise me.
How many of them got degrees from Lehman Brothers?
That is a very subtle, just like slap across the face. I love it. Just shots across the bow. I also feel like what's going on here is, do you remember when they turned on the Large Hadron Collider, or when they were about to, and everybody was like, guys, you can't do this. It's the largest particle accelerator that had ever been built at the time. And they were like, maybe if you turn this on, it will tear a hole in the fabric of space-time, and we will all get sucked into a, Klein bottle, and we'll cease to exist. Or maybe it'll do some terrible thing to the space-time continuum. I feel like when they flipped that switch, we thought nothing bad happened, but instead what happened is we flipped into the upside down, and it's finally coming to roost. We're living through just the craziest possible timeline. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, as a lapsed physicist, I'm pretty party to that line of thinking. In fact, I think Richard Feynman was a nuclear physicist on the Manhattan Project when he was relatively junior in that project. I think they tasked him with doing the calculations to ensure that there wouldn't be like a catastrophic runaway chain reaction from the nuclear fireball igniting the atmosphere and incinerating all life on the planet. And so he ran the numbers and thought that was unlikely, so they went ahead with the Trinity test and do it live, man. Do it live.
I mean, he was right. His math checked out. Earth still exists. Humanity continued.
I do love that they were like,
humanity doesn't progress without taking some risks.
You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. I also do Q gave you a fantastic intro, but I also just want to say you have an incredible. I always feel like I'm fanboying whenever you come on. It's true, I totally am. But you have an incredible breadth of knowledge, and I would encourage everyone to follow Matt on Twitter. He posts some of the highest, I'd say signal, highest detail, and most informed, just like streams of consciousness of anyone on Twitter. It's quite impressive. Speaking of which, I want to ask, what do you think people are sleeping on? You post about so much. What is something that over the last, let's say on a several week time scale, the last several weeks, what's the story that you feel like the average person or people in Bitcoin land are not paying enough attention to? Everybody's obsessed with FTX right now, but what else is going on as far as you're concerned?
Well, there's a lot going on. So for me, it's odd because the world is both extremely complicated, but also seems to be focused on some like critical single anchor points that if they flip in various directions, like big things move, sort of world historical things move, right? So I think over the past few weeks, one of the things that I sort of was an anchor point that I think has been de-risked has been Ukraine. So I think we reached sort of maximum danger in sort of the Russia-Ukraine situation several weeks ago. That I think most of the news stories, if you sort of read between the lines, basically show that that's sort of heading for sort of a rough stalemate and, kind of jockeying for negotiations eventually. But there was a period, about a month ago when there was acute risk of escalation, even the use of nuclear weapons, and that was freaking everyone out.
How do you think that at that point that could have played out? You mentioned sort of nuclear weapons. What was the pivotal moment there, or what were the two possible paths, and then what changed in your mind?
I mean, this is all looking through the mirror darkly. It was really over Kherson and exactly how quickly Ukraine would be able to move in, whether that position would collapse, and overall kind of negotiations behind the scenes that it was reaching a crux point. And Russia was, threatening very aggressive, very overtly and covertly to use tactical nukes. And Liz Truss was personally checking the weather because she was worried about, radioactivity somewhat absurdly going to England, which was never going to happen, especially with a low yield device, but was indicative of the level of sort of angst at the senior levels in sort of Western capitals that sort of was filtering out into the mass media, but sort of through a filter. And only we sort of pick up on it, after the fact. And I think now you're sort of seeing, stories come out about pushing, for talks, Zelensky being open negotiations, this sort of grain deal that was, that fell apart. And then Turkey said, no, Russia, you got to get back in. Basically the writing is on the wall now that they're sort of reaching a common. So we're looking for like peak risk, right? We're sort of over the hump of peak risk. But now I think we're looking ahead, and that's sort of more acute situations, right? So I think first and foremost, it's a step back, right? Everyone focuses on basically like what the Fed does, because that effectively determines the macro environment for all assets. And then I think the equivalent to that in the geopolitical scale is what President Xi does. That's over a longer time scale. Now, I think, everyone has a take on the sort of Taiwan scenario. You can go down that rabbit hole. But from like a sense in which there's a lot of chaos, there's a lot of noise, there's a lot of events that occur. But for me, like the main strategic drivers of radical change, right, are going to come down to like a handful of key people making key decisions over the next few years. And one of those decisions is going to be made by President Xi. And that's for all the marbles, basically, right? So I look for, these are kind of the sort of tail events or sort of the extremely high consequence decisions that you don't see play out day to day, right? They only occur, and then when they occur, there's a hard pivot in terms of the course of events. And so, you can sort of prognosticate and try to prepare and posture for the way things could break or pivot, depending on what those sort of forks in the road, which way you take. But that's usually where we're like, a lot of effort and analysis is being taken across all the key actors in the global system, is trying to now navigate through a world that has these like critical markers laid out in the next few years, and everyone is now having to recalibrate themselves and prepare and plan for a range of scenarios that they hadn't previously brought into sort of the aperture. So like, for example, like the stuff that I track, right, in the Bitcoin and crypto world, like these things seem seismic, like the CZ SBF thing seems like, oh my God, like drama. I mean, it's
in
like,
the scheme of things, though,
it's like a bug hitting the windshield, right? Like, I don't really care.
Tell me more
it.
about how our last 30 minutes of talking didn't matter.
It matters. I mean, it's certainly relevant. All right. I think it's for market structure purposes, for consolidation, for, balance of power, who's getting liquidated. Certainly there's a compelling story there. But from like from a perspective in terms that I try to take, like what really matters in a few years,
well, let me on the heels of sort of this idea or this possibility, we obviously are in the middle of an election today. Both the House and Senate are pretty much up for grabs, and there's conversations that they may flip, they may not. Can you walk us through, like, is there a scenario in your mind that is better served that the House and Senate be under this party's control in the event that something like this does come to fruition?
Well, that's complicated. So, point one on the China specific front, which I think is probably the most important kind of geopolitical topic, now and then for the indefinite future. China is going to loom ever larger in both sort of the traditional foreign policy geopolitical discourse, but it's going to become increasingly relevant to our political discourse, to our economic policy, trade policy. We're going to increasingly face, a more across the board economic warfare between the two countries that's going to have cascading impacts throughout different industries. And it's sort of starting in certain industries, but it's going to expand. And eventually it's going to become somewhat of an all-consuming competition, if not strategic rivalry between the two countries. And so that's going to bring it from kind of this, relatively kind of domain-specific thing. Like there's the China watcher community and people who follow the 20th Party Congress and are, really trying to understand everything to do with the COVID lockdowns. But as it starts to become the defining strategic competition, it's going to affect, global markets, going to affect most industries, and it's going to affect global asset prices because, how that relationship unfolds is going to cascade through everything. Politically, what that means is that, where there is consensus, where the sort of center of gravity for U.S.-China relationship in DC, how that moves has sort of dramatic effects. And I think it is one of the few issues on which sort of the median member of Congress, has somewhat consensus on being hawkish against China. So just as Speaker Pelosi went to visit Taiwan, that precipitated, effectively a crisis.
And a quick little pump in NVIDIA's stock price. Sorry to interrupt you.
It's very likely that Speaker McCarthy, assuming the Republicans take control, he will also be visiting Taiwan and will likely precipitate an even more sort of vocal reaction by the Chinese. So I just see this as a one-way ratchet, sort of regardless of who's in power. There could be, and if you like to where the most aggressive moves have been made on that front, there are executive actions. So there's a whole suite of executive orders that have already come out. The most recent one was the sort of the set of measures taken against China's ability to access certain types of semiconductor technology, which is a very aggressive, somewhat unprecedented move to essentially try to hobble the Chinese ability to advance technology in that area. There's going to be more coming on that front. There's going to be outbound investment screening to limit the amount of investment of U.S. capital into China. There's going to be additional controls likely placed on other technologies, artificial intelligence technologies, quantum information technologies, potentially biotechnologies. So there's a whole set of things that are going to continue to come out of the pike. There are going to be executive orders, basically.
How does that actually work, though? And apologies for asking such a basic question, but like in today's modern era, how does one country effectively stymie the developments in another country in that way? How effective are those types of strictures?
So it gets quite technical. I don't want to bore the audience with like the acronyms, but like this is as old as there has been global trade, as long as we had like industrial society. So you may go back to the British and the German rivalry that led up to World War I. The British tried to do something similar to hobble a rising German industrial power. They tried to put on effectively sanctions, economic.
And that worked pretty well, if I remember correctly, right?
Yeah. It was great. Yeah, it worked out. I think actually it led to, these are somewhat semi-industrialized countries. Like about 500,000 Germans died as a result of
holy shit.
The blockade.
Wait, directly as a result of those blockades? I was kidding. Obviously, this led to World War II indirectly, but
it's been a while since I read this was pre-war deaths in terms of like food issues, medicine, disease, other sorts of, that's a number I remember reading from an analysis I read a while ago, so I could be wrong. But it was a severe like economic competition, and we all think that they were like chit-chatting and then decided to like do World War I. Like no, there was like multiple years of like aggressive attempts to measures short of war, mess with each other's economies, and that was done through similar sorts of trade restrictions, export restrictions, their version of industrial espionage, etc. During the Cold War, we set up these things called these COCOMs, these coordinating committees, with our sort of Western allies to restrict the Soviet bloc's ability to access our technologies, and so all the major sort of aligned Western nations participated in these coordinating committees to say, here's the things that we will not sell to a member of the Soviet bloc. And we will have an inspection regime. We will have, essentially a bilateral relationship, to kind of enforce these things. And they did this with like chip technology. Like chips have been military technology since the beginning. Like they were, coming out of World War II, the first computers being used to crack codes, and then once we could create integrated circuits, use them for guidance for ICBM. So like they've always been military technology. In fact, only recently have they become more consumer oriented in terms of the scale of their production. But fundamentally, we've had this sort of these systems in place. It become a lot more complicated to enforce in a globalized system, and this is where the more recent actions I think are really going to be kind of a test case for how effective these can be in the current situation. Because for example, chips, and there's a whole separate conversation just to have about the chips thing, we don't really make those, right? So we're not limiting our exports to China. We are trying to impose a global ban on China's ability to access third parties' technology because there's a critical intervening part of the supply chain that comes to the U.S. So we have, just like certain technologies for manufacturing and design that are like critical inputs to someone else's production. And so we're basically saying, well, if you want access to this piece of the technology, like the condition is that you don't sell the end product to China. There's a whole bunch of other enforcement regimes. It gets really complicated because a lot of our partner nations, Japan, South Korea, the Netherlands, that are critical members of the sort of the chip sort of global industry, China's a big market for them, and China has positioned themselves as a key piece of that supply chain. And so you're asking folks like Samsung, who's a national champion of South Korea, to, and I think South Korea is like 25% of their exports go to China. So it's a big deal for them to basically say, like, we're going to take a hit because U.S. tells us to. So these measures that were just put out were just U.S. only. They were unilateral measures. They were quite restrictive across a whole set of domains. But really, they require our allies, Japan, South Korea, the Netherlands, to really come on board, and they haven't yet. And there's like a 12-month period that they sort of are hoping to kind of work this out and get them on board and do some inducements, but it's a very complicated negotiation. But this is the game that we're in now, is really trying to, we went from, I think, strategic competition, which is I would say a word where you describe it like you are trying to just beat the other guy, but you're not trying to knock the other guy down. You're just trying to outpace them in development. That's what I think where we were up until recently. Now we're in sort of strategic rivalry where you're willing to, you're trying to actively hurt the other guy, but you don't want to take measures that hurt you, and like specifically. So
that's an interesting distinction.
And then the next level up from here would be strategic enmity. So enmity, where you're willing to take a personal hit as long as it hurts the other guy more. And that's where you get to sort of a negative sum, sort of spiral security dilemma. Like that's usually where you start going towards war.
Can you repeat those three tiers one more time?
Yeah. So strategic competition is sort of like you just focus on your own benefit, like your own strengths, and try to outpace the other guy. Strategic rivalry is where you actively try to hobble the other guy and end run faster. And strategic enmity is like just tackle the other guy and know that you're going to take some hits, but like you try to hit him worse and make sure that he loses more than you. But you're willing to take a net loss in that scenario just to stop the other guy from passing you. And that's sort of a dynamic you see in a lot of historical episodes. We have rising powers, try to retain their status quo sort of leadership. So all these things that I see, like the global chessboard, sort of like are all in this larger context, which is sort of and it's relatively recent kind of phase shift in the global dynamic that was sort of, I think, being long planned by the Chinese, but we're sort of shifting gears. They have had a multi-decade strategy, and there's a great book by a gentleman who's currently on the National Security Council staff, basically the China director, who wrote this book before he went to the White House, called The Long Game. And he went through archives of Chinese materials to say this has been their grand strategy. It's like laid out in hundreds of documents. And it's basically first thing to block. It's like a blocking strategy. It's like bide your time, hide your strength, and just try to basically mitigate to a certain extent the hegemon's ability to coerce you. But it's just a blocking strategy just to protect yourself basically when you're not that strong. Then there's a building phase where now you've at least established domestic economic strength, start to build out some of your military for just protecting your own littorals, and then you want to build on that. You want to invest in more advanced capabilities, start to project some more strength in international forums, and that was kind of to the 2008, 2013 stage, like building your capability, but still trying to play nice on the global stage. And then I think they shifted in 2016 with Trump's election, Brexit, and the trade wars to an expansion, more aggressive phase where, okay, pretty soon the hegemon's going to wake up to us. It's kind of hard to hide these capabilities, that we're aggressively investing in to push the U.S. out of the Western Pacific, and we should expect a counter-reaction, and we should just sort of let the mask sort of come down. And that's the new phase. And I think COVID and then Russia's invasion, I think cemented this sort of new regime. And then the White House is sort of reacting to it, right? These measures on chips and sort of the talk about there being a more kind of bipartisan consensus on this U.S.-China rivalry is now becoming explicit and much more sort of manifest. So I think this is just, it's happened. It's been building for a while, but I think it sort of recently in the past year or two has shifted a lot.
Interesting.
Yeah. And that's, I think, a lot. This is coming from usually starts in the intelligence circles, so people who study this, just study China, then in the DoD world, and it sort of filters into the normal policymaking world, and eventually gets to economic policymakers. And then once that happens, once we start doing blanket bans on entire industries, then the CEOs of big companies start to sort of pick their ears up and this is a different world than we've lived in for the past 20 years, where China was our growth market. All of our strategies for expansion and all of their personal careers were anchored in a worldview that saw China as part of this integrated global market. They would move into that market aggressively, and maybe there would be some nice story that they would tell themselves that the Chinese were happy for us to believe that this would allow them to liberalize and democratize as they got richer, et cetera, which was itself a very explicit information operation directed by the the Ministry of State Security for decades through a number of different front groups. This is like a very calculated thing that they implanted in the minds of Westerners.
Wait, the Chinese government did, or that our own government did?
No, the Chinese government. So there's a great book called Spies and Lies, where a researcher goes through, the MSS's sort of influence operation starting in the 80s when the MSS kind of really came on the map, which is their equivalent to the CIA. And like the United Front Work Department, and a whole bunch of these like forums, or like the China Dialogue Forum, or like the China Reform Commission. There's like sort of benign sounding things that a lot of our elites and former politicians and Westerners kind of would like, oh yeah, I've got this guy who's like going to help me get meetings, and he's like an academic. All MSS operators, but they were really successful at basically convincing, like the Hank Paulsons of the world, the former Goldman Sachs and Treasury Department leader, that China was going to rise peacefully and was going to integrate to the global system, and there'd have to be some accommodation and balancing power, but fundamentally, they would reform and they would open up. Right, that was the line. And a lot of this, corporate America and the Western multinationals, that was a good story, but finally it was like a market, and it was like, we need to dive into that market. And they developed their whole operating model, the whole business plans around that. And now it's like COVID, and then this is like, it's like a 1-2 punch. And a lot of companies are trying to recalibrate their overall strategy to a world where that's not going to be the case anymore. And that once you unwind, that's not just the supply chains; it's also your information architecture, your overall strategy. Like, where's the world going to grow? It was China. Now it's like, well, not China anymore. And these are like icebergs. I mean, these are like cruise ships. They don't just like turn on a dime, but when they do, they don't change direction again.
Yeah. How is that narrative? Q, I want to give you an opportunity to jump in. I could mine this. I have so many questions about this.
Like, the only question I kind of wanted to chime in, because you kind of made mention to it, but I think I followed it correctly. I want to make sure that A, I did, and B, our audiences as well.
Mm-hmm.
You alluded to the fact that, superpowers historically have tried to hold on to their power and influence around the world. This is, though, the first iteration for the United States. Would that be a correct assumption to draw, that we have never sort of dictated foreign policy to then almost have it be ignored by our allies around the world? And what is the significance of that?
Yeah, I mean, certainly the closest, I'd say, equivalent time period was the immediate post-war period. And actually, I think that's probably the most, if I had to draw any analogy, again, there's no perfect historical analogy, but I'd say the closest historical analogy is the immediate post-war period, so like 46, 47 to like early 50s, where the Soviets were, a very aggressive and very successful power. Like, they were consolidating the Iron Curtain across the Eurasian periphery, and the United States had just spent huge amounts of money out of World War II. We had lots of debt. We had extremely high inflation, like 20% inflation in the late 40s. We had these sort of double dip recession. You look at like the Lynn Alden chart, you can see like very similar sort of period right now where we had the spike of inflation, then it came back down, recession, another spike of inflation, the 50s came back down, but they had yield curve control, right? And there was the Treasury Fed Accord. But geopolitically, Russia was a pure power, and they, we were, there was all sorts of memos in the DC apparatus, like, how do we, like, this is a new world, like, the beginning of the Cold War, how do we, fight this war? And Korean War was the first sort of entree into that, and we had Sputnik, and there was like a real sense that like, it wasn't like American victory in that global competition was not inevitable. And eventually we sort of, geared up, and the Soviet system couldn't keep pace. But in that early period, it was not an obvious answer how this competition between economic models, geopolitical blocks would unfold. But we've never really faced a peer competitor where their GDP was more than 60% of ours, even in the early Soviet era. And China reached, I think, 75% of our GDP I think last year, and they passed the 60% threshold by 2014. And by purchasing power parity, they're way over in terms of that as a GDP measure. So this is a very unprecedented geopolitical sort of state of affairs, where you have a peer competitor that is a serious peer competitor. Folks make, there's lots of weaknesses to China you could talk about, right? Like their housing, $90 trillion of debt, their demographic issues, the whole Peter Zeihan thing, right? I think that is I'm way less sanguine on the risks of China's rise. In fact, you can make the argument that it's China's peaking power now-ish that makes the acute danger between the conflict between us actually higher, right? So if they were really assured of their inevitable rise to take leadership of the globe, that U.S. was sort of inherently crippled, driven by political and economic decay, then there'd be really not much of an incentive for President Xi or any Chinese leader to, trigger a conflict. Just sort of let it happen. Just sort of just glide to the top of the mountain and let us sort of destroy ourselves and eventually kind of decay. The real risk though is that China recognizes that because of these structural forces, that their peaking power, like relative to us, is likely to happen now or the next few years. And so if they wait too long to sort of try to change the status quo, it might be too late. We may eventually get our act together. We may eventually get allies in the region to sort of come on board with us in a contained China strategy. We may aggressively push a whole bunch of weapons into Taiwan to make it change the balance of power for any military operation. We may get our shipbuilding capacity up by the 2030s. We may politically get somewhere as we sort of get millennials into power, into positions of power. So and China's going to have this demographic cliff, right, in the next starting now, but really in the 2030s. So that to me is a different narrative to put around why the risk is higher now-ish. Is not because China is inevitably going to take over and U.S. is inevitably going to be weak. It's actually there's just sort of two lines, and U.S. is kind of relatively weak now compared to China's rising strength, but China's rising strength relative to us catching up could close the gap by the end of the decade. So that means this decade is kind of the crunch, the crunch time.
Man, that's so interesting. So how do you think this, two specific questions. One, do you think that the US will actually ban TikTok ever?
TikTok, I thought they were going to say Bitcoin. We were going to go there, yeah.
With P, that's never off the table.
Yeah, but, we can follow up with that one. TikTok is interesting. So actually a colleague of mine, Dakota Carey, who's a China specialist, he's written an op-ed about TikTok. And I think people misconstrue the risk from TikTok being malware on your phone and China's going to backdoor, and spy on you. That's not really the risk. The real risk, I think from a strategic level is psychological. It's what they call sort of political warfare, right? And and they have a very broad definition of kind of their approach to sort of influence operations and psychological warfare. And they view these instruments as tools to essentially degrade our capacity as a society, right? And I think they see it not as a specific cybersecurity instrument or doorway into a certain network. They see it as a way to essentially wage cognitive warfare against the minds of the American people and principally our youth. And I think it's a strategic problem from that perspective. Banning it there's a whole legal question over what does that mean. You could just for me, I need to see exactly the instrument of power and the justification that's being used to ban it, because there's an national security argument for why it's a high risk. But that doesn't mean that you just wield executive power to ban a certain technology. Right? I think we can all agree that we'd want there to be more checks and balances on
I need a yes or no.
The executive banning it. I don't think it's going to be banned. I think there'll be all sorts of measures done on the margin. There's things you can do, like future laws. We don't have data privacy or data rights laws in the United States at all. That's a whole different debate. But once you apply the precedent to TikTok, you'd have to look at, okay, well, what's the rationale that would also apply to lots of other things, right?
Yeah, you got some very uncomfortable questions
on all sorts of technology platforms. So is it okay if we're being manipulated by Facebook and Johnson and Johnson and every corporate advertiser? That's fine, but when it's China doing it, it's we're going to ban it. It's well, okay, why doesn't China just pay Johnson and Johnson? Or it's okay, it's just because it's a Chinese app doesn't mean there aren't other ways you could manipulate US. And that's a whole thing, where you draw the line. That's where I think I haven't seen a real solid bright line. But that once you establish that precedent, how are you going to apply it elsewhere? I think we need to draw a line somewhere, and we need to be pretty clear about the justification, but it wouldn't just be TikTok then. There'd have to be something to generalize on that. But
I mean, most people would be
but you should
horrified.
delete TikTok. You should delete Facebook. You should do those things anyways. Like, that's my personal recommendation. I think
Twitter.
they're not good for you. No, Twitter's great. Twitter's awesome.
So, do you think I've heard rumors that the way that TikTok is set up is if you are a Chinese citizen or if you are geolocated in China, you
This is
get presented.
a true story. Do not say this is real.
Wow.
This is real.
Well, I want to hear Matt's opinion here. That basically, if you are in China, if you are a Chinese citizen, you see much more.
Do your homework, study.
STEM
exactly.
oriented
And
math tips, science tips,
like
engineering tips.
Actual, real, super valuable content. And if you are anywhere else, especially in the US, the claim is that you see just the absolute like garbage. Yeah, exactly. Just like distracting nonsense content. Do you have
all the dance TikToks that you and I made last time we were together?
Oh, of course. Those were quality. And if you tell me otherwise, Q, I will fight you. No, I'm curious. So is that true? Do you know?
Yeah, no, I've seen the same reporting. That's true. I think it's two forces though. It's both there being, the algorithmic firewall between the one that they developed for China and the one that developed for the United States, but it's also, I think, reflective of our cultural sort of orientation, right? I don't think it was like, doing frivolous dances was just like a Chinese op. It was like we just like doing dumb shit and like giggling and like we're sort of distracted, consumerist, like in our culture, we just don't value these types of things. And so they're not going to go viral and the algorithm isn't going to, reinforce those things over time. So I think it's like you could paint it as though, it's all a grand manipulation by China. I think that we should also look in the mirror. It's like, was our culture all that healthy and like studious and, focused on, kind of hard achievement before TikTok? I'm hard pressed to think that like it was TikTok that turned us all into just, attention deficit disorder, kind of mindless consumers. Like, I think that's been an issue since, for many decades.
What are you trying to say, Matt? What are you trying to say about American citizens and people?
Well, so
Why do you hate Christmas?
There's a great book that almost nobody reads because it's 1,000 pages long called Infinite Jest by David Foster Wallace, and it's sort of a classic, sort of postmodern, kind of ironic book. But in the conceit of the book is there's this videotape that when you watch it, it's so like powerfully overwhelming, entertaining that you sit and watch it until you die of starvation, dehydration. And then this becomes like a weapon that terrorist groups and nation states try to fight over to try to get this thing, get the entertainment, because it essentially holds so much power. And this was written like in like the 90s, so I think it was I think prescient to see how our modern era faces. But that just those were trends that were pointed out in the early stages of the internet that I think have just metastasized.
The reality is so much more insidious. It's that there is not a single video. It's all of the videos, and we do it to ourselves.
Yeah, I think a lot of this, and you look back throughout the Cold War, right? A lot of the analysis done on disinformation and psychological operations and sort of the Cold War competition, it's always usually there's certain elements of disinformation that are all about like coming up with something fake and getting people to believe this fake thing. But that's actually hard to do, and it's usually done only like on the margin. The easier thing to do is take things that are true, people that already tend to believe, and just reinforce them to the extreme. And block out, their attention to other things, and focus so much emotion and so much attention on something that's true, but it becomes a distraction, or it sort of exaggerates, its relative importance. And that's much easier to do because people are much more inclined to believe those things because they're obviously true. But and that's like how you try to fight these sort of society-wide cultural battles, which have now been reinforced because we're now so hooked to the algorithms. But yeah, that's a very tricky problem, right, for open society, right? China has solved this problem by just not having an open society, by just saying, we control the algorithms, we'll control the feed, and it will be, duty to your country, respect your elders, do your homework, don't play video games, like the perfect boomer, algorithm, right? Because it's all boomers that are running these systems. And like people in China, right, don't have much of an like alternative view, right? It's just, okay. We actually interview some of the typical Chinese sort of middle management of these companies, like the AI companies, the sort of like the novel justification they give is like public safety. It's, these, look to the West. It's all decadent, and they're, obsessed with video games and drugs, and we want to have a nice, harmonious society. And behind that is like the dark totalitarian boot, right? That's ready to stomp on you if you get out of your lane. But the public face of it is it makes everything efficient, makes everything clean, makes everything organized, and you don't get this disruption. You don't get the chaos that you see in the West. That's the narrative. That's the propaganda pitch, which is compelling for some people, especially societies, where you're looking like to a respective model, like the third, I wouldn't say the third world, the rising world, right? The developing and emerging markets are trying to look to which model they should follow. And that's a big competition that's taking place right now is, do we want to, are we going to, and they're worried, right? Like they don't want to have to pick sides in this split. They don't want to pick, they don't have to be forced to choose. Am I going to be in the US block? Am I going to be in the Chinese block? They see like risks on both sides. And so if they can find like a third neutral option, and in the monetary domain, I think this is where the Bitcoin tie-in comes in. It's like giving them a way to hedge their bets, in a way that doesn't force them to commit one side or the other. It allows them to maybe retain some degree of autonomy. They don't have to hitch their wagon entirely to, the monetary and digital infrastructure of a particular block that, effectively sacrifices some degree of autonomy and sovereignty. So that's going to be a major dynamic, I think. And that's where, things like CBDCs come in. And that's, I think, where, the major forces are going to start to play out in the next 5-10 years.
Can we come domestically for a second? Come back to our borders and, build that wall, worry about ourselves. On the tail end of this election, on the tail end of, tail end is the wrong word, but on the beginnings of this FTX SBF debacle, we spent a lot of time talking about how much money SBF has thrown at regulators this year. At the same time, we've also seen a growing conversation here in this country around CBDCs. What are your expectations going into next year of how will regulators be handling the broader crypto market in particular? How will they be looking at things within our borders first?
Yeah, so divided government, for one, usually means like legislative sclerosis, right? You're not going to expect much big, I think, packages to pass. And if they do, I'd be surprised. But that just sort of means there probably isn't going to be much big legislation pushed. That's like my default assumption. I know there is, one particular bill that's, been in the works for a while that is like an outside chance it comes up for a vote, and it could come up in the lame duck. I don't follow that like I'm not doing like the whip count like exactly, and people in the DC kind of ecosystem kind of can handicap that better than me. But I'd say it's an outside chance that something like that could be passed. I think in general, and then you could probably see more executive actions in the intervening time that could be problematic for certain parts of the industry. There's been executive orders, obviously the big digital assets executive order that precipitated a whole bunch of these reports coming out from the executive branch. That I think across the board, if you had to like generalize, like the vibe was like latently negative towards the whole industry, with like pockets of like surprisingly like neutral to positive, like paragraphs, right? And so it's like, it depends on like, what your bias is. Like you're looking for any grains of hope. You're like, oh wow, they actually recognize the value of like flare gas mining in the EPA and OSTP report on digital assets energy consumption. And that's like, from being, but at the same time, they also cite, basically DeVries and Digiconomist like 50 times. So like in the net, right, it was more on the negative side than on the positive side, but there were surprising, I think, like wins in some of the policy space. Big legislative action I don't see taking place now. There is an interesting, I was talking to some folks, it's like tactically speaking, right? Like Bitcoin is politically, kind of doesn't have a tribe, right? There's no like implicit like alignment between, say, Republicans and Democrats on Bitcoin. I think just sort of practically speaking, the current political mood has made kind of Republicans generally more favorable to Bitcoin than Democrats. Like I think that has sort of been the temporary axis of alignment. So that, net, right, I think you could see slightly more positive things coming out of a Republican House. But but I don't think they'd be passed, right? It would just be kind of shifting maybe the tone of some community hearings or certain amendments that, get softened a bit on the margin. But I'd say for like crypto more generally, right? Like, it's not good that you have these effectively shadow banks just like, taking each other out in public and precipitating overall, disorder. I think like the market cap has fallen to a certain point where like the major regulators don't see it as like a major financial risk in terms of spillovers. So they see it, I think it even fell out of like the top 10 of like their list of like financial stability risks because it's just not big enough yet, or not anymore. And so to a certain point, they don't like care from like a macro stability point, but they do care if like a whole bunch of like, FTX retail investors are like hosed again. And this seems to be like a pattern, right? Of like Celsius and, all these, and Luna, Terra, like all these things seem to be blowing up. And guess what? Like the billionaires and the rich, VCs seem to be coming out just fine. And then everyone has, is in bankruptcy court for the next 3 to 4 years. Like, it's not a good look, right? And I think just as an industry, it just seems like amateur hour, right? Like you just, and there are things you could do. There's things you could do proof of assets. You could do proof of reserves. There are things you could do to try to mitigate, market contagion and the sort of FUD-driven panic shadow banking runs, which is what they are basically, right? Like FTX is a shadow bank, right? It issues effectively a liability that's a fictitious entry, just like a shadow bank issues like a liability that's only as good as you trust, the issuer. And when you have your own token as your main collateral, you're asking for trouble, right? And it's like this isn't new, right? This is what we've seen shadow banks blow up for decades, right? For doing the same thing in TradFi. And I think crypto land thinks they're just like, oh, we can reinvent all this. We can have the magical money tree. And it works just fine when you're printing money on the upside. And then it's like, it all falls apart in like an afternoon. Guess what? Like, because you didn't actually invent anything new. You just played the same sort of game with a different vocabulary. And yeah, like that obviously doesn't mean that like regulators are going to like look any better, like look at you any kindly, right? You have to do yourself any favors. And SBF himself has like held himself up as like, like the representative of crypto to DC.
Yeah.
I didn't vote for him.
We were just talking about this. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's like, I don't know the guy personally. And I'm sure he's a nice guy. I have no like personal judgments. I don't know.
But I do.
I just look at this as like a market, as like, DeFi, just, like if maybe you could like squint and you could read someone's white paper and be like, yeah, that seems to be like an interesting use case there. And then you open your eyes and you look at actually what's happening and you're like, most of it seems like Ponzi and most of it seems like, basically pump and dump and kind of front running schemes. And it's like, okay, well, that doesn't seem like a very healthy, innovative, net productive use of capital. So, in general, I don't have a whole lot of sympathy for those losses, but I do think that again, Bitcoin doesn't really care. Bitcoin's going to do itself, and just it's going to be taken up by the overall market instability. But yeah, I think in DC, I don't know. It's a whole political game, right? Like we got to see how 2024 plays out and larger macro conditions. I think there will be things like in stablecoins, there seems to be a rough consensus on like a framework there, roughly. There's, I think, a big debate over how stablecoins can be codified. I think there's an agreement that they need to be in some form or fashion, and the big fight is over, how much do they get, sort of absorbed by the Wall Street Borg, right? Does like Circle just become, a subsidiary of JP Morgan? Like that's like one version. Is there a larger remit for narrow banks or special purpose depositor institutions to issue stable coins? Again, it's kind of like a niche policy debate, but that's one I think where because it's more narrowly focused, because it's sort of separate from the larger questions of DeFi and securities regulation, it's probably easier to get traction on that. And then, then there's the rest of the space, which to be honest, like, I care about it as much as I care about lots of policy issues, but I don't have like a personal dog in the fight of like, I don't know.
No, I mean, I don't mean to cut you off, Matt, but candidly, this conversation, all it's done to me is made me realize like, oh, this FTX Binance stuff is truly like a little grain of sand in the broader beach that is the chaos that's about to, he looks frozen. But to finish the idiom I was trying to say is, it essentially feels like we're watching a lot of things happen on a more global stage that will have a greater impact on our day-to-day lives. That while this FTX Binance debacle is impactful today, how China, Taiwan, how these things play out in the future, how the US dollar and US's sort of foreign policy is received throughout the rest of the world, that's what's taking up your time. And that's what sort of has you most concerned. Is that a right way to?
I mean, I see all this as like a cleansing fire, right? I see this as like, bad business models and unstable, cryptonomics need to break before they get too big, right? And that was the view with Lunaterra. And it's like, if you have a bad business model, it's not sustainable, it should be destroyed. Like, because the longer it lasts, the bigger it gets, the more the harm comes. So like, I actually get worried if there's too much quietude in the crypto world, because it should have these blowups. Like, that's its function, because it doesn't have a lender of last resort. It's just all shadow banks and all crypto Eurodollars, and driven by like pure id, right? For the most part, of like 20 something, dudes, right? So it should have periodic explosions of greed and collapse, if it's functioning as that sort of type of market. If it's not blowing up, it means someone's hiding something. It means that there's probably like a beach ball under the water some. So I just expect this is like the basic pattern that's going to happen, until the market matures, which is going to take some time. You just can't have business models that are just based off of like, don't look down, right? Like, indefinitely. And if you sell yourself as like the future of money, like, well, you should walk the walk. So yeah, I just think Bitcoin's the most interesting asset, for lots of reasons, but the only one that's like on any meaningful time scale and any geopolitical scale is relevant. So everything else is interesting from like the crypto space, because I think it has implications for market structure and capital sources and regulatory, angst, and that could have spillovers to the views of the sort of naive observer about Bitcoin. But I'm just trying to like separate out, like, people I talk to in the national security space is like, Bitcoin is the thing. Like, everything else you should be aware of and understand, but like, these are different things. Put them in different buckets, assess their implications separately, and make policy given that distinction. And does it mean that like larger crypto DeFi shouldn't exist? Like, sure, I believe things should exist. I think people are free to make their decisions freely. I just think from like a policymaking and a sort of a consumer understanding, like, it's important to draw a bright line between these things. And so I just see like the FTX CZ battle is like a interesting, like, yeah, it's a fun story, but like, it doesn't change my view about Bitcoin at all, right? Like, it's sort of irrelevant to that.
Absolutely.
So,
absolutely.
Am I pulling a P? Am I muted? No. Okay, cool. We have about 5 more minutes. I want to remind everyone in the audience who is watching, we're going to hop on over to Twitter Spaces in just a moment to discuss all of the stuff going on with FTX, with Binance, with none other than Dylan LeClaire. If you missed the beginning of that show, I would not recommend rewinding right now while we still have Matt Pines giving us so much alpha. Like, I almost feel like, dare I say, the FTX could just be a little bit more noise, and what we're really discussing here is the real signal. Like, we talk a lot about just the importance of Taiwan. I want to really emphasize this in Bitcoin terms, and I'm going to make it really simple. All of your fucking microchips for everything you fucking use, from your cell phone down to all the Bitcoin miners that you started up to your brand new car that you have an eye on, it all comes from Taiwan. Like, that is, in case you didn't get that note somewhere along the last 2 years when every single media organization talked about this, you need to understand this is not just a posturing for the sake of 2 old guys' ego. No, this is genuinely so you can buy the new iPhone 14. Was that too crass?
Yeah. No, I mean, this is we've built our consumer society on electronics and digital information and digital services, right? And that world built up in a world of like unprecedented geopolitical stability, right? Anchored with the global hegemonic dominance of the United States. And, it doesn't mean that like the world's going to just shift overnight, but it means that like it's a different environment that you should expect in the next 5 or 10 and 15 years. And it's hard for people to grok that, because like most of our lives were sort of growing up in kind of the halcyon days of, the unipolar moment. And then, we made these, typical imperial hubristic mistakes with Iraq, and we had the great financial crisis that sort of focused on internal politics, and geopolitics kind of went to the back burner or became like a domain of like Sunday news shows. Are we going to do an Iraq surge, or are we going to do a reset with Russia or whatever? And now it's like, it's going to become omnipresent because it filters into every aspect of your lives, right? Where you get your stuff. is that going to come the next time? I think COVID sort of woke us up to this. And, I think we felt that it was just going to be like a temporary disruption, and then everything was going to just settle back to normal. It's not the case. So yeah, that's why, Taiwan matters. That's why these things matter, because they're highly path dependent, right? And we live in a very highly nonlinear, call it like nonlinear couple dynamic system, where like the butterfly flaps its wings and you get a hurricane, right? It's why you have to pay attention. I focus on like all the little things, because those little things can turn into very big things very quickly. As we see with, FTX is a good example of this, right? Oh, there's some weirdness going on with CZ, and why did he just post that thread? And then, all of a sudden, whatever, the token falls by 90% in a day, right? Like, these systems we built, like, look stable and then they break, right? That's why I like Bitcoin, because Bitcoin is one of those systems that, like is by definition decentralized, so it can absorb lots of shocks. Like the China mining ban was a great example where it took a massive hit, exogenous shock, boom. But then, the hash rate is at all-time highs, right? Doesn't mean the dollar price is going to be stable, right? By any means, it's going to likely be highly volatile. But these are very different models for how you think about building systems, and that's what attracts me a lot about Bitcoin, is that they model of a type of system that is assumes nothing's going to work out, and assumes that things are going to break, and you just need to build resilience and redundancy, decentralization to those systems. So you're not vulnerable to single points of failure. You're not vulnerable to an opaque balance sheet or a single person making a bad decision. And then that has cascading implications to everyone who, is anywhere nearby. So yeah, that's sort of my broader thesis, right? To kind of connect these things. It's still important to look at FTX and be like, this is,
to learn from it.
We should draw lessons learned on this. And yeah, like you'll see it reflected in asset prices. But if you're not a day trader, if you're not like trying to time the tops and bottoms, like it really doesn't matter to you, right? Like what's going to happen to you tomorrow as a result of this, right? Nothing, right?
Absolutely.
Whereas,
nothing draws a starker contrast between in terms of the difference between like Bitcoin and then everything else that is part of the supposed, cryptocurrency market than events like this in my mind. These types of exogenous shocks are just further confirmation for me anyway of the true value of Bitcoin.
Matt, I want to give you an opportunity to give any final remarks and tell everyone how to stay up to date with all of your big brained ideas, and hopefully P will stop harassing you in your DMs.
Actually, he hasn't DM'd me. I've been feeling a little bit left out.
Oh shit! I've been holding myself back.
Have I been DMing Pines more than you have?
Oh, for sure. I basically
love notes.
Yeah. I mean, Q, it's a little weird. You showed me some of those messages. I felt uncomfortable on both your behalves, but I've been holding myself back.
Those are on Signal. Those are auto delete. Just
I see. Okay, got it.
Gotta have OPSEC, bro. No, I mean, hit me up at Mathew_Pines. Been supporting BPI, so check the website out there, btcpolicy.org. So David Zell, Grant McCarthy doing some great stuff over there. If you want to donate, go to the website. I'm sure they'd love to have some more funding to support themselves. I'll be at Pacific Bitcoin this week. I think I'll be on a panel doing some talking about something. And then if you happen to be in the C-suite of a large multinational and you have concerns about geopolitical or cybersecurity risk, hit me up. That's my day job. So thanks for having me.
Awesome, man. Well, thank you again so much. I want to remind everybody, we will be starting a Twitter space in about 1 to 5 minutes.
30 seconds.
Dylan LeClaire. 30 seconds,
Literally
excuse me.
30 seconds.
With Dylan LeClaire, Dr. Jeff Ross, Pete Rizzo, myself, Q, others, where we will be diving into all the noise, talking more about FTX, and really going into exactly what has happened there. I want to remind everyone as well that if you do not already have a ticket for Bitcoin 2023, you can use code BMLive to save 10%. You can also use code BMLive for everything else in the Bitcoin Magazine store, including an edition of the print magazine. We will see you tomorrow. where I will see you in 30 seconds, and then we will be back for this show tomorrow. We will also be having an election live results special tonight at 9 p.m. Eastern. Q, myself, Nolan from the Breakup Show. We'll be diving into everything. So we'll see you in a minute. Peace.
In a moment.